Welcome everybody. Everybody's on mute right now. I'm going to keep it that way until the end of our program if we have time for questions, just out of respect for our speakers and for ourselves so we don't get a whole lot of background noise. I know most of us are at home right now, so we never know who's going to pop in the background. I'm going to give it just another minute before I start the introductions to make sure everybody's in. But for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jessica Young. I'm currently at Mount St. Mary's University in Maryland. I was a longtime member of the Frederick Community College crew, but still teach there. But today's webinar will be really exciting, and I don't hear any more beeps, so we'll go ahead and get started. So I want to welcome everybody to the fourth and final webinar in the Uncharted Waters series. The Maryland Online Leadership Institute was really pleased to be able to offer some online programming in place of the residential program that we traditionally host in June. And as you know, for reasons related to things completely out of our control, we did have to cancel the program, postpone it until next year. But for those of you who don't know about the Leadership Institute that we refer to as MOLLI, for the last 4 years, we've offered a really unique leadership experience. It's an institute tailored to rising distance education leaders in the state of Maryland. Our alumni include Dionne, who is our wonderful moderator today, but also about 75 librarians, faculty, student support personnel, deans, and associate vice presidents. Today, our panelists will discuss a very relevant topic that should have always been a focus for us, but it has come to light more so in this pandemic. We've been lucky to invite panelists that will represent the entire spectrum of education from K-12 all the way up to the four-year institution. And the topic today is addressing that equity gap that exists for so many of our students, but particularly those of color. Our unique panelists, as I mentioned, include leaders from K-12, the community college, and four-year institutions. So just a reminder, stay on mute until the end so we can make sure that they have opportunity to speak. I'll briefly introduce everybody. We have Lisa Smithson. Lisa earned both her bachelor's degree and master's degree from Howard University and is going into her 22nd, year of service with the Howard County Public School System. After teaching at both the elementary and middle school levels for 10 years, she obtained a position as assistant principal and has served in the role of principal for the last 8 years. She is currently the principal of Murray Hill Middle School, a diverse school with nearly 740 students and approximately 100 staff members. Next, representing our community college realm is Dr. Michael Mills. Dr. Mills is the Vice President of E-Learning and Innovation and Teaching Excellence Elite at Montgomery College. Dr. Mills oversees faculty and staff professional development, as well as the distance education programs and the library. That seems a lot. His focus is providing faculty and staff the professional development necessary to positively impact student success and on using open educational resources, OER, to reduce the cost of education for students. And then finally, representing our four-year institutions, we have Dr. Yolanda Abel. Dr. Abel is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Advanced Studies and Education at Johns Hopkins University School of Education. She's also a faculty affiliate with the Center for Social Organization of Schools and the Center for Safe and Healthy Schools. Her publications appear in American Education Research Journal, Journal of Negro Education, Education in Urban Society, and School Science and Mathematics Journal. Dr. Abel is currently the chair of the Family School Community Partnership Special Interest Group within the American Educational Research Association. Her dissertation, African American Father Involvement in Their Children's School-Based Lives, earned the 2008 Judith Rutchkin Research Award from the Maryland Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development. In 2017, she was awarded the inaugural Excellence in Mentorship Award for providing quality mentoring experience for junior faculty at School of Education. And she was the honorable mention for the Provost's Prize for Faculty Excellence in Diversity. And our moderator today is Dionne Thorne. She is the Instructional Teaching Specialist for the Johns Hopkins Carey School of Business, and also as I mentioned, one of our Molly alumni. We are really happy to have her lead this panel, and I'll turn that over to you, Dionne.
Thank you, Jessica, and I would like to extend my thanks to our wonderful panelists. Thank you so much for discussing this important topic with us. So I'm going to start with K-12. I'll ask the question to everybody, but I'll start with Lisa because I think we've seen a lot of focus and attention when it came to the shutdown on K-12. So Lisa, what was your initial reaction when the county announced it would close down for face-to-face instruction and switch to remote?
So I guess my first reaction was I thought it was a good choice just because of the pandemic and the uncertainty and the health and safety and well-being of all of the staff members, within my school and within the county. And originally it was just supposed to be a 2-week closure, although there were definitely, talks about, I think it's going to be longer than 2 weeks. The very first 2 weeks in Howard County, anyways, we were completely shut down. We did send our students home with some work packets, not necessarily anything that was like content specific, but just things to kind of keep their minds engaged for what was going to be the 2-week period. And staff really were not expected to really be engaged in any work during those, those first 2 weeks. As we moved on and saw that it was going to be longer than that, and it was a little interesting because we kept piecemealing it together. It was first 2 weeks, and then it was an additional 4 weeks, and then it was actually the entire rest of the school year. So, there was a lot of uncertainty, and I think those were my first reactions, like, what do we need to do? How do we need to plan? How are we going to get our kids what they need? How are they going to be able to engage? So just a lot of unanswered questions, in the initial onset of the school closure.
So a little uncertainty, your initial reaction.
Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Mills, I know Montgomery College is so far ahead of everybody in terms of their online presence. But so what was your initial reaction when Montgomery announced it would close down for face-to-face?
Well, I think like Lisa, there was some concern. We had been following for several weeks what was going on in the state of Washington and the universities and colleges there. So we had already started developing a plan prior to the decision. And I think the question for us was not so much if we were going to shut down, but when were we going to shut down? And then what was going to happen as a result of that. And our decision was made just prior to our spring break. So we had a week in order to work with faculty. And to their credit, they took on the challenge. They didn't go away for spring break. They didn't disengage. Many of them stayed around and took opportunities of the training that were provided. But I think the initial reaction was just one of what is going to happen to our students. I thought as an institution we were going to be able to get through it okay, but we had so many students who would be facing uncertainties, and how were we going to accommodate them?
Okay, thank you. Dr. Abel, what was your initial reaction? And I would like to specify the School of Education and Johns Hopkins. I mean, you are located in education, and Johns Hopkins has an overall plan, but specifically, what was your initial reaction within Hopkins and the School of Education?
Thank you. Much like other panelists have already shared, some relief in the sense that we were looking at the precautionary health of everybody involved and wanting to be home and shelter in place, but much more complicated. The School of Ed is one of 9 Hopkins schools. So while you're asking about School of Ed specifically, we took our guidance from Central, and obviously there was a major concern on the undergrad front of how you move students out of dorms on and so forth. So much like other schools, P12 and community colleges, we shut down as well. And that was primarily a directive focused on undergrad. However, we are a graduate school for the most part with a fairly large percentage of online programming. So those programs had no noticeable impact. Those classes that we do offer face-to-face did kind of stop for about a week so we could recalibrate, share resources, get people up to speed and get them teaching. So the break was not quite that long or substantial as it was in other places. Our bigger challenge, if you will, was around managing the mental health and the time commitment of our students, because quite a few of our students are classroom teachers, are administrators, are superintendents in school districts. And much like the other two panelists have discussed, they were on the ground creating those work packets, delivering food to families, who are vulnerable for a variety of reasons. So we had a challenge making sure we were managing the expectations of their graduate work with the new demands of their professional.
So with that said, and that's a great follow-up to my next question. So you were helping your students, graduate students specifically, manage that transition and also help them manage their school districts like Lisa. Were there discussions within your graduate students about how the stay-at-home order unveiled the inequities of, regarding access and resources for many students? Did you hear a lot of discussion and conversation among your students regarding the lack of resources and access for many students, and specifically those of color?
Yes, again, quite a few of our administrators or district people, so how they could strengthen or implement a one-to-one device program, because not every student had a device at home, internet access, and I'm in Baltimore City, so while Comcast has its Internet Essentials program and families were able to sign up, there's that added complication. If a family had a defaulted bill with Comcast, that needed to be taken care of before they could get that access, the food, the management. Early learners posited a different challenge, because 4 and 5-year-olds, what do you do with them in a screen type of space? So yes, we had all kinds of conversations, resources, and ideas to support them as they were doing this work on the ground.
So did you feel like you were, the conversations of shared information, do you feel like as though that kind of helped the students address some of those issues, or knowing that they weren't alone with some of those issues in terms of access and resources, like you were saying, when it comes to Comcast and your cable bill? Was it good for students to feel as though, oh, I'm experiencing that as well in my institution?
Yes, they are definitely always looking for ideas. We have quite a few people in DC as well, some in Virginia. So in terms of the locality and the commonality, we're still having those conversations as school districts are announcing plans for the fall, in terms of whether or not they'll be online, what they plan for hybrid and when. They're looking for those best practices and things that have found to be successful thus far.
Thank you. So Lisa, with that said, has Howard County come up with a plan? I know these things are fluid, they're ongoing. I know some of the districts were announcing their fall plans now as we speak. So the stay-at-home order, as I said, quickly revealed those inequities. How did your institution or your school, your specific school district, your specific school in Howard County address the inequities regarding access and resources, and specifically those of color?
Yeah, so, one of the biggest tasks, we are not a one-to-one device county. So that was, at the forefront of everybody's mind, how to get devices in students' hands so that they could access the distance learning plan that we had during the spring, and then continue doing so, obviously, as we go into this upcoming school year. So, the personnel at central office really scrambled. They got monies together. They went into the schools and they pulled laptop carts out of our schools so that they could be distributed to individual students. Some of the setbacks with that was that families had to request whether or not they needed a device, and the way that you requested whether you needed a device was electronically. So if you didn't have internet or you didn't have a device, it became very difficult to make that request made known to people. I know in my school in particular, like we have a Hispanic Achievement Liaison who works with all of our Hispanic families. I mean, she was working double time, you know, in the spring, reaching out to the families that she services, making sure that they understand, finding out what they need. My assistant principals were working double time, trying to make sure that people had what they need. Another setback that we had in Howard County with our device deployment is that initially, when we were delivering or deploying devices, families had to come to pickup sites to pick them up. So that presents another layer of essential workers who can't get there during the pickup times, and of families that don't have transportation, that couldn't get to the pickup locations to pick up the devices that they stated that they needed. So that was definitely a disparity that occurred. We then moved on to shipping the devices via Fedex. That was a whole nother fun mess because FedEx was running way behind. We thought we were getting 2-day shipments. I mean, we had kids literally who did not get their devices until mid-May. And we were obviously coming to the end of the school year by that point in time. I did look at some data, like of the 740 students in my building, we currently have about 270 students who have borrowed devices from HCPS. And of that 270 students who've borrowed devices, 226 of them are people of color. So it kind of goes to show the need of those, you know, people of color, the need for those devices. We're also working on hotspots. We didn't get that as solidified during the spring as we hope to get during the fall for our families that need that. And the other thing that really popped up were the actual grades. Now, Howard County was very gracious in our grading policies during the fourth quarter for all of our students across the board. The students literally had to complete 50% of their online assignments to get a pass. And it didn't have to be correct work. Just as long as you showed good faith effort in that work and completed 50%, you would get a pass. So again, in total in my school, we had 311 incomplete grades, not 311 students. Some students got multiple incompletes, but we had 311 incomplete grades. And of that 311, 270 of those incomplete grades were attached to students of color. So, you know, you see those disparities right there in those data points.
So how, I mean, going forward, how are we going to address that disparity? And you just highlighted one school in terms of students of color, and probably Dr. Abel might be able to provide a little more information in terms of the impact of that in Baltimore City in terms of devices, how are students going to collect their device? And I think it's really, you know, kind of an odd choice that you have to request electronically, but you don't have it electronically. So has the district come up with other ways for people to inform the school that they need a device instead of it being electronic? I mean, has that something that they've worked on over the summer?
It's not anything that I've been in conversations in over the summer of how we continue to ensure that the students who need have the devices that they need. You know, in my own school, and my thoughts are, we're able to see who is and who is not engaged in distance learning. You know, who's turning in assignments, who's attending, you know, the virtual synchronous learning that we have. And then it's just really going to be about getting on the phone and making phone calls to those individual families where you see students are not engaging, checking in on their welfare and well-being first, because that's first and foremost, quite frankly, and then finding out what they need so that their students can actively engage. So it's going to be, you know, it's going to be grassroots, you know, feet to the ground kind of efforts and picking up those phones and making phone calls.
So the good old-fashioned telephone is a tool that is at this point for some families most effective in terms of meeting their needs.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Mills, with the community college students, I know in my time at a community college, a lot of students use the computers on campus. So how did the stay-at-home order address the inequities? And you mentioned previously that the college was working on a plan. Did the plan include addressing such inequities? I know Montgomery County is a rather large county, So for students who didn't have a device, how were you going to get devices to them? And as Lisa pointed out, the inequities were there in terms of students of color. So I guess I have a multi-question in there. One, did your initial plan address access for students? And if so, what was the plan to make sure students had the devices that they needed in order to complete their work?
Our initial plan did not include looking at access because I don't think we understood how widespread that need was going to be. We are a large county and we're a well-resourced county, but we have pockets of poverty within the county, and those are our students. And so I don't think we realized how widespread the issue was. It was compounded when Montgomery County Public Schools announced around the same time that it was also going to remote. So at the community college level, many of our students are parents as well of students at MCPS. So they had to juggle not only their own education, but the education of their children. Compound that with so much uncertainty around their jobs and whether they were going to be able to keep their job. I think as it turned out, and we tried to let our faculty realize this, education at Montgomery College was not their top priority at that point. It was taking care of their own households. And so as a result of that, our foundation really stepped up, and they allocated about $500,000 to provide resources to students who requested it. And many of those resources were in the form of technology, but some of it was in just rent and the basic food necessities to help those individuals who may have lost jobs and really were struggling. But even with providing the technology, what we didn't provide was the Wi-Fi access. And so we had students who would be sitting in our parking lot accessing our Wi-Fi from their cars just to try to stay up with the education. We did, when we provided the technology to the students, they could come to one of our campuses. And we were doing what Lisa had mentioned, just pulling computers out of laptop carts. And I think it got to the point where we weren't quite sure where all the computers were coming from. And so going forward, that's going to be a nightmare as well, just trying to replenish back to where those initial computers came from. But then we ran into concerns, and rightfully so, I think, of our own employees not necessarily being comfortable handing out the devices. Because if you remember back, in that mid-March, there was so much almost panic about what this was like and this uncertainty. So we just had employees who said, I'm not comfortable doing it. So then we had to work around all of that and still try to maintain some semblance of education in a remote environment. At the same time, staying within our semester parameters.
I think, as you pointed out, community colleges, because most of your students are working adults, trying to balance working, educating their kids, and then maintaining their education is a huge challenge. So going forward, has Montgomery discussed any strategies that they can use to lessen this gap when it comes to, as you mentioned, health, wellness, education, food security, employment, all of these things? And it's July, we've been in this pandemic for several months, and we're still having conversations about what school's going to look like in the fall. So given all those concerns that each panelist mentioned, have your institutions adopted strategies to lessen the gap regarding food security, rent, education, not only in some cases of students, but as well as the adult learners, and specifically referring to Hopkins? Have you addressed some of these gaps going forward so that we can make sure students are learning?
I can say at Montgomery, one of the things that we've done through our foundation is change our priorities on fundraising and to seek donations that will go directly to emergency relief for a number of our students. That even goes to soliciting our employees for those donations. So I think, at least for us, it's just been a shift in priority as to engage the private sector in Montgomery County, but also the public sector in Montgomery County to try to help out the students. And I think during this time, the emphasis really for us has been on community in the community college. And, you know, our concerns are the community's concerns. You know, if the college is experiencing certain issues, then the community as a whole is experiencing those same issues.
Dr. Abel, in terms of School of Education, or what strategies have been implemented to help lessen the gap? And as you mentioned, you have students who are actually, I would say, are in Lisa's
front line. Yes.
Sorry?
Because they're on those front lines that are being described by our other two panelists. So the School of Ed has also created an emergency fund. That's a grant that students can apply to help offset the cost of tuition, rent, or whatever the issue might be, because they've been furloughed, experienced job loss, because there's been a lot of angst around that, and organizations are making decisions about how they will operate or not operate. I have two advisees who have both been in a panic for most of this last month because their organization was announcing layoffs. Thankfully, neither one of them was laid off, but they work for organizations that have let go up to 20 people, different organizations. So there's a lot of mental anguish that is going on at this time. So the other thing that we have been more strategically doing is having opportunities for drop-in happy hours. As working adults, most students are freer in the evening. So we call it a happy hour and it's open. Come talk for 10, 15 minutes, just drop in, get that acknowledgement. You're not alone in this process. We are welcoming you. In last semester and continuing into this semester and most likely the fall, we instituted a pass-fail policy, which for most of our courses we did not have. So we're trying to do things to eliminate or mitigate the stresses that they are experiencing as part of this process. And while we haven't necessarily talked about it this way, staff has been interesting as well when they have now been working from remote. So in instances where needed, we've provided hotspots for staff if they needed that in order to be able to do their job and continue the work. Talking with supervisors again about being somewhat flexible on what that workday looks like, because some staff have children as well and needed to spend time when school was open and virtual learning. So there's been those types of efforts to kind of help us better support our students and our staff as they have been trying to work through this pandemic and what it means for them, both mentally and if they have school-aged children.
I think it's interesting that you are, and great that the college is also focusing on staff, because I think we focus a lot on students, but as you mentioned, staff may be experiencing some of these challenges as well. Trying to work at home, what does your workday look like, educating your children. If you only have one computer in the house and everybody needs a computer, how do you manage all that? So I think focusing on staff, but also keeping in mind people's mental wellness and mental being is critical, especially because we've been at home, if you will, and some people aren't able to get out. That I think is a piece that we really need to continue to focus on as we move forward through this pandemic. Lisa, what strategies do you think the county will institute to help lessen this gap in terms of access, resources, especially, and I'm interested in your school with you cite the numbers regarding students of color.
Yeah, And before I answer that question, I just wanted to highlight another disparity that I was thinking about is that, there is this misconception that, especially, in the K through 12, because, these are digital age babies, that they know how to do online learning, because they've got the cell phones and they grew up in this age with electronics all around them, but that does not translate into how to learn online on a digital platform. And so we see a lot of that going on. I do also want to highlight, like in our county, and I know in other surrounding counties also, taking care of those basic needs has been a high priority. That's definitely a high priority. The health and the safety, the well-being, the basic needs is definitely a priority point for us. We have set up, as soon as school shut down, we immediately went into a mode where we set up like food distribution sites, and any child from the age of whatever to 18 years old could go to those food distribution sites on a daily basis. They could pick up meals. On the weekends, they were providing extra meals to help the families get through the weekend until the food distribution sites were open again. On Monday, they've continued that through the summertime, and they're going to continue it through the first semester. Right now, we're closed the full, virtual learning the full first semester in Howard County. They're going to continue with that. They've also have plans to arrange the students' the student schedule in the fall, so that there is a nice chunk of time in there where students actually have time and opportunity to get to the food distribution sites in the middle of their school day. So they've kind of backed up this 30-minute lunchtime, also with a countywide 45-minute or hour-long planning time for teachers, so that families have that opportunity to get to food distribution sites during that period of time on a daily basis, so that they're not missing out on that opportunity for meals. So there was more to your question, Dionne, that I think I didn't answer, so can you remind me?
We'll have, it kind of goes into my next question, but what strategy, I think you did discuss some of the strategies that the county is going to implement to help some of those gaps in terms of food security, rent, and having access to those things. So we know that the lack of access to adequate technology was an issue for many students. What other gaps in services do institutions need to address as we prepare for the fall? And I know this is fluid because I know institutions are still making plans in terms of the fall, but one area that I was concerned or had some interest in was accessibility. How are institutions addressing that in terms of students' needs? And Lisa, you pointed out not all students are familiar with online learning, and it does require a little more work to make sure courses are accessible. And so I'm wondering, has that also been a part of the preparations for fall? In addition to the lack of technology, what other gaps in services do institutions need to address as we prepare for the fall?
Yeah, I think that just continuing to that mental health piece, and someone else had mentioned that, is huge, because, mental health is, it's very prevalent, especially in my experiences at the middle school level. And so we need to make sure that those students are being supported with their mental health. At my school in particular, we're lucky to have a school-based mental health program where we're actually able to refer students, and they meet with a clinician who, when we're in brick and mortar, comes into the school on a weekly basis and provides services to a small group of our, individual services to individual students. So we were able to continue with that in the virtual world, which we're very pleased with. The other thing that we're doing in Howard County, in the spring, the students still had to focus on, at the secondary level, they still had to focus on all 7 of their classes. That's, the number of courses. So we are shifting to a 4x4 model this upcoming school year. So the students will have less courses that they have to focus on within the semester, which we think will make it a little bit easier for their time management instead of focusing on so many classes. So that's something that we're hoping helps to just kind of alleviate some of the stress and pressure of how many things they have to focus on at one time.
So at the national level, the president and others have been called on schools to reopen because it's critical, and they point out the need for some of these services, specifically for students of color, because we're not in school, they're not getting those services. But at the same time, I think Dr. Abel mentioned their parents are frontline workers. How can we actually balance this? I mean, what can institutions do to address the needs of students of color whose parents are specifically more so impacted by having to work? As Lisa pointed out, they have to go to work, so they're not here with their students. How can we address this gap that we're starting to see in terms of access for students of color in terms of returning to school? Dr. Abel, what are your thoughts in terms of, we've heard, yes, students have to come, we need them to come back to school. And, there's been a lot of discussion regarding students of color because they need these services, but also so they don't fall behind. What can we do to make sure, as you all said, that their mental health is also being addressed if they're home and they only have one computer or they have limited access? How can we make sure that these students are not falling behind? Because in some cases, sending them to school may do more harm than good. So as educators, what can we do to help address that gap?
As Lisa just said, schools will still be doing some of that. Even though schools were not open this past fall, and I imagine spring, and I imagine this upcoming fall, there will still be those opportunities of those food giveaways. There probably are dedicated personnel who are still visiting family homes of our most vulnerable and at-risk students and families to touch base and touch point. So some of that is still going on. However, in the virtual space, if I can connect this answer with your prior question of kind of what else do we need, I think the other adults, we also need some additional tech training, because that might not be our natural niche either. So what are all those tools out there? The Slack, the Nearpod, the Flipgrid, those types of things that can make learning more engaging rather than just kind of sit and talk the way we're doing at the moment, or the asynchronous read and post. So I think those kinds of opportunities, and if we can do some of those types of things, that also builds in that time for that check-in, that how are we doing, depending obviously on the age and the content level of the student. What are the opportunities to create poems, visual representations that both meet the content metrics and standards, but also might allow a child an opportunity to express the types of things they're thinking and feeling as we are going through this pandemic. So I think we need that creative blend of both social emotional learning and the content in ways that allow both the adults and the students to kind of navigate this unknown time we find ourselves in.
Oops, thank you. I think that's a really unique perspective in terms of how do we continue to navigate this, because it looks like you're right. We'll probably be in this position throughout the fall, and I would like to hope we return as to school in the spring semester. But Mike, what are your thoughts about what are some of the other things we can do, and how do we fill in these gaps for students? Because we know there are needs, and I think your population is really different because you have students who are adults of kids in school. So how does that impact your, Montgomery is when the school district is closed, how does that impact your students' ability, and what gaps do you think the college could fill for those students?
Well, certainly when MCPS is closed and when they closed, our students at Montgomery College found themselves having to juggle a number of different things. They had to be parents, they had to be employees, they had to be students themselves. And as been mentioned, that mental health part really is crucial. But along with that, I think we tried to focus on the mental health of our faculty and to stress to them the need to be flexible, but that flexibility often resulted in 15, 16-hour work days for them. They were just people were exhausted because our students during the day were trying to take care of their own children and getting them through their school. And then they may be focusing on their own education in the evening. And then as a result of that, they would email or try to set up some Zoom meetings with their faculty. So I think the faculty mental health part is equally important. The accessibility issue that you mentioned in your question played a huge role for us in the spring semester. We struggled with that because I don't think anyone really had envisioned the need for the resources if we were going to go remote. As a result of that, we instituted an incomplete and crisis grade, and that helped students just lengthen the time that they could complete the class. And while traditionally they have maybe a semester, this with the IC, they've provided a year for them to complete the class. But you know, we really have worked hard this summer to get our faculty to up to speed on the technology. As Yolanda had mentioned, we're training 700 faculty this summer using CARES money to provide that engagement piece. So it's not just self-paced. Students aren't left out there on their own. The faculty will be teaching in a remote environment, but a synchronous remote environment, with the understanding that students are going to need flexibility. And if they can't make that scheduled class time on a particular day, they may have to, they may be asking for resources after the fact.
I noticed you mentioned training, as did Yolanda. So it's encouraging to hear that faculty are being trained to, you know, adjust their teaching styles and techniques for the mental health that students may be experiencing. And we have about 15 minutes left. And I have one question, and I want to point out, if you haven't been looking in the chat, Yolanda posted a couple of COVID parenting tips. So you might want to download those before we end. So my one last question is, because I want to make sure we have time for the participants to ask. In general, how did this event change your perspective on leadership? And Dr. Abel, would you like to start?
I don't think it changed my perspective. I think it reiterated that a leader needs to be involved and invested in the community. They need to know people, open lines of communication, the flexibility of decision-making. Some decisions needed to be made like that. And then as we got new information, sometimes they needed to be reversed or modified. So keeping those open lines of communication are really critical. And I think that is one of the things that has helped SOE weather this storm across faculty, staff, and our students, in terms of how we have been sharing information to the best of our ability and looking to build connections among people so they didn't feel so alone and isolated, and that we are all in this together and dedicated to all of us doing well and making it through this pandemic time.
Thank you. Lisa, as a principal, how did this change your perspective on leadership?
I agree with Dr. Abel. I don't think it changed my perspective. I think that, you know, in ways it made the things that I am used to doing more challenging. But, you know, I am one who, I try to lead in a way where I am being open and transparent with my staff so that they have all of the information that they possibly can. I try to lead from a place of calmness, because when everybody is up in arms about the ambiguity, like, the leader has to be calm. I can't be running through the building, screaming the building's on fire. When the building is on fire, that can't be my role. You know, so I think that those things, that the ways in which I already lead were just amplified and more important to make sure that we're happening consistently for my staff. And I think that, you know, when we go back to the disparities of our, you know, our students of color, just continuing to share the data with my staff so that they realize and they understand how this shift that we've moved into continues to affect our students, because it's not like our students of color were not affected before the pandemic,
Right.
but they're even more so affected now. So we need to make sure that we're keeping that on the forefront of our staff's minds, so that they can get into the classrooms, engage with our students in a way that, you know, hopefully is beneficial to all of our students, but certainly our students of color.
And Lisa, thank you for making that point, that our students of color were impacted before, and this has probably just compounded that. So how do we make sure that we are still caring for them in this environment and meeting their needs in this environment? And I think it's great that you're focusing your staff on that. Those needs did not disappear. They've probably become more important during this time period. Dr. Mills?
I don't think, like the other two panelists, that my vision of leadership changed. I think it was enhanced during this pandemic, focusing on the flexibility, but also understanding that there are times when we just had to admit we were going to make mistakes during this. And we made a lot of mistakes, and we continue to make a lot of mistakes. And, you know, the key, I think, is to understand that you're going to make those mistakes, own up to them, and just do the best that you can with the information that you have at the time the decision is made. We made a decision early on at Montgomery that we were going to go remote in the fall. And we didn't hesitate with that. We didn't struggle with that. We made that decision. And then we worked to get everyone up to speed for that fall semester. Likewise, we're talking now about what to do for spring.
Right.
Because if, you know, at least in my perspective, if we wait until October, November to talk about spring, it's too late for a number of our students, because they have to start making plans from a registration standpoint, from a child care standpoint. So we're looking at that, make a decision, be firm with that decision, but also understand that if flexibility is needed, you're going to have to change on the fly, as has been mentioned.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have a couple questions in the chat, and I'll read them, and I don't know if they're for the entire panel, for the panelists, or just one person. Reagan Education wants to know, are there suggestions to changes to curriculum to represent a broader, more diverse information, and how do we do that correctly?
One of the reasons I said to put it in is to see what kind of process you were interested in. That can be a daunting task. And my school-based panelist, Lisa, definitely can talk to this. We all do some form of curriculum audit process development. So what's the equity lens, the set of questions or resources that you will be looking at to see whether or not you are being inclusive in the types of materials that you are providing, and the content covered, and the perspective. So like if you want more concrete things, I probably have some, but that's my generic answer.
Thank you. Thank you. Lisa, I think that's again, a very broad question, but as a school-based K-12 person, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, there have definitely been there's been a lot of conversation around looking at curriculum items in Howard County, and certainly being more inclusive. You know, as a school-based administrator, I don't have, you know, much influence necessarily over the curriculum that's taught, but certainly having conversations with my staff with the curriculum that you have, what are things that you can do in your individual classrooms to bring in more diversity? You know, in the science class, how can we talk about scientists that people don't oftentimes talk about, that are scientists of color who have done or are doing wonderful and great things that nobody knows about because it's not brought into the classrooms? What kinds of literature can you bring into your classroom so that students can access? So, excuse me. So those are some of the conversations that we're having on the ground level, but the curriculum piece is bigger. I know that I have been in several meetings this summer about our high school African American Studies course, because in Howard County, it's only one semester. And we all pretty much feel like that is not sufficient. That is not okay. So I know that a lot of principals have been voicing, concerns with that and asking people to take a look at things like that.
One of the things that we're balancing or trying to balance is this need for curriculum revision at the classroom level, the faculty level, with the concept of academic freedom. And how do you balance those two? And it's not necessarily an easy balance, but when you take the pandemic, the racial inequities that have played out across the country, and the upcoming election in November, all of this is playing in the minds of faculty, I think, as we enter the fall semester and selecting the curriculum. And so it's trying not to make administrative decisions along those lines, but informing the faculty that here are opportunities for you to revise what you teach in your class and the material that you choose for your students.
Another question from Doug. What changes in teacher education / training need to be made in light of the pandemic?
At Montgomery, it was a focus on using the technology that we have available for faculty, and just making sure that they understand that it creates student engagement. Using the learning management system was not a condition of employment in the past, but moving forward, it will be a condition of employment on the job postings, that you have to have experience with that.
I would concur. If SOE struggled in place, it was around that issues of placements for our pre-service teachers and for our counseling candidates, because as schools and mental health organizations shut down physically, our students, it took a while to get guidance for how our students could earn their hours. So I think some of it has to be that conversation of those creative virtual ways that still might count for the hours that are needed for pre-service teachers and counselors. And that hasn't moved enough, in my opinion, in terms of the professional organizations that support that and or provide accreditation to us as an institution. But I also think on the teacher prep side, yet again, what are the ways that we are helping pre-service teachers, and I'm talking pre-service because sometimes we do get the in-service, but our pre-service teachers utilize technology effectively, and how do we balance that out with firewalls that sometimes actually exist in school districts so that they can learn to be doing these types of things, that it might not be as heavy a lift if school systems need to continue some hybrid form of education in the future.
And I think, for us in terms of the teacher training is, my staff is asking, as we talk about our professional learning plan for this upcoming school year, and there's a desire to focus less on just the curriculum kinds of things, but also to focus on how can we engage the students in an online platform. I know that we found it very difficult to, when we did our synchronous sessions, to talk to a screen full of avatars, and to try to encourage kids to, unmute themselves and talk, and they weren't. I popped in and out of different Google Meets, and, teachers were, they were doing their song and dance. They were trying so hard to get the kids to respond, but it was very difficult. So I know that, and that's across the county talking to colleagues, I know that that's a huge concern. Like, what can we do to really get our students really actively engaged in the synchronous?
So it seems like it's teacher training in this new environment, because we're going to be here maybe for a while. So how do we train them? And I think, Lisa, you made a good point earlier about students grow up using devices, but they don't necessarily know how to engage. So maybe it's a lot of training for teachers, but also really explaining to students how this learning platform is different from gaming or connecting with your friends on social media, or even trying different technologies, as Dr. Abel mentioned, into the classroom that they may be more familiar with. So how do we put our arms around all of this to make it a better learning experience for our students and make sure our teachers are properly and adequately prepared for this new environment. And we have one question and we have 2 minutes, and I really want to be mindful of everybody's time. So quickly, how will this time of crisis make things better in the future?
I think our education is going to be stronger going forward. There's a lot of pain initially, but I'm an optimist in that I think go forward we'll see a better product for students.
I too am hopeful, both from the perspective of the pandemic and the current heightened awareness around racial issues in the United States, that this might be a genuine opportunity for us to look at learning and the ways in which it changes the needle, both for an individual and for our structures of how we operate and the outcomes of how we are contributing members of our society and the larger global society.
And I agree with both panelists, but I also want to say I think that one thing, not so much on the student side, but we're learning to effectively utilize our time more. We don't always have to meet face-to-face for meetings. I think about how many times as a principal I'm called out of my building to go to a meeting, and I can do that in my office from my computer now because this is now kind of the way that we've done things. So I see that as a positive.
I agree, and I think, as all of you said, this is the time, now, if not us, who, if not now, when, that we can make substantial and critical changes to education, and specifically with the racial disparities that we're seeing. We can't let this moment go. We have to take it and go with it. If we want to have a more equitable society and a more inclusive world, we have to take this moment now in this time of crisis. And I think good leaders can do this. And it sounds like we have some really great leaders with us today. Does anybody have any other questions, comments? I want to thank the panelists and the participants for their time today. I really appreciate it.
Dionne, thank you so much for your moderation. You've heightened this to a level that I could not have expected as a wrap up. Some of the takeaways is, we started with uncertainty, but relief for the safety of our families, our staff, our colleagues. Looking ahead, we have a lot of work to do. We did a tremendous overhaul in the fall semester or spring semester, but we still need to move the needle forward. I cannot thank our panelists enough. This was a really great conversation. I appreciate everything that you put into it. And with that, we will end this session. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right, Dionne.
Thank you, speakers. You were terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Take care, all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.